Hello and welcome to another episode, in fact, a whole new series of Reading Together from Sea Harp Press. I'm Eugene Luning, co-founder of Sea Harp. And in case you're new to these series, what we do in Reading Together is we read together. I read to you a classic Christian work, pausing here and there to bring out maybe a piece of scripture or one of my own memories of something I learned from that chapter. And we meander our way through great books from the history of the church. In our last episode, we finished up Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and I told you I was excited to tell you where we'd be going next. Well, here I am. I'm excited. Because as I'm recording this, it is the lead up to Christmas 2023. And I don't know about you, but when I get to the Christmas season, first of all, I feel like a kid again. And second of all, I'm reminded of some of my favorite things to read when I was a child leading into Christmas. And well, one of them, maybe it's the same for you, was C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. This right here is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is volume 1, although I will say The Magician's Nephew is sort of a prequel to the whole series, but was only written in the 6th position in the Chronicles. And I want to tell you this is not part of the Sea Harp catalog. I always want to remind you of that. This is in fact a Collier Books Macmillan Publishing Company edition of the work. And as you can see, this was my actual childhood edition, so you can see how much I enjoyed it all the way back many moons ago. So I'm sure many of you have read this work, but I think it's kind of lovely to take our time, to read with imagination and joy. And I'm planning, instead of pausing here and there in this fictional work, to tell you little tidbits as we go. I'm going to read whole chapters at a time, and then I'm going to share with you what was most striking to me, to my heart, to my own pursuit of the heart of Jesus in that chapter. What was revealed? Maybe in the comments below, you could do the same. As you listen to me read it to you, what stuck out? What was kind of a fresh revelation you took from the words of Lewis in this particular chapter? So, without any further ado, we're going to be reading chapter 1 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This title of this chapter is Lucy Looks into a Wardrobe. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, which grew over most of his face as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said good night to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room, and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet, no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we are heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Snakes," said Edmund. "Foxes," said Susan. But when next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out of the window, you could see neither the mountains, nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them. A long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore in the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected that they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor, and after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. And then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall, and a door that led out onto a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books. Most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty, except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it is very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel woodwork against the tips of her fingers. But she could not feel it. "This must be a simply enormous wardrobe," thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. "I wonder, is that more mothballs?" she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hands. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "This is very queer," she said, and went on a step or 2 further. Next moment, she found that what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it is just like branches of trees," exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at nighttime with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it is a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. I can always get back if anything goes wrong, thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood toward the other light. In about 10 minutes, she reached it and found that it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming toward her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upward, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat's hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler round his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked just as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a faun, and when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the faun. Well, friends, isn't that just one of the most wonderful openings, not only to a children's book, but to any book? Just the sheer imaginativeness of picturing that professor in that great house, the long hallways and passages, down 3 stairs and up 5. And then, of course, the classic image of going through the wardrobe, feeling that texture of the fur coats and suddenly finding yourself bristled by pine trees on the other side. I can't think of an opening that's more evocative of like a place, a time, a feel than that. And I want to say, for me, what struck out, and I would love to hear what you were noticing as I was reading to you. In this edition, it was on page 4. I love this. It's when Peter says, "Not for me, I'm going to explore in the house." And it's the next sentence that caught my attention. It says, "Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began." Friends, I would imagine, since you are a very literary crowd, that you've probably read this book at least once, maybe 10 times. So knowing where this book is going to go, it's right here on the cover: the witch, the wardrobe, and the lion. Knowing all that it means allegorically as we get closer and closer to the reality of Jesus, I want to remind you that you and I are about an adventure. We don't know what it is yet. We've maybe only heard like the beginning of the whisper of the voice of Jesus saying, "Follow me." But I want to tell you that we need to begin this day in following Jesus, in opening out our hearts, our spirits, our minds to his Holy Spirit, so that just like Peter, Edmund, Lucy, Susan, you and I are following into an adventure that is never ending. So as we open chapter 1, I just remind you, as I often do in reading together, life with Jesus is a grand adventure, filled with ups and downs, filled at times with great triumphs and at times with tragedies. But to actually begin is what we are to do every single day. So as we read this famous children's work, I would invite you today to follow Jesus, to see where he's leading next, to find out what door he's opening that you are to walk through, and maybe even to get a glimpse of a whole different reality, the kingdom of heaven that is, frankly, right here with us. So we have been in chapter 1 of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I can't wait for chapter 2. Have a wonderful rest of your day.